All right, welcome everybody. This is a session for the Fabian Society that is devoted to Peter Davis, talking about 15 years of KiwiSaver. Is it time for a review? Thank you so much for agreeing to do this, Peter. It's important that we have this discussion because I think you've got some rather important issues to raise and to challenge the KiwiSaver industry with. And thank you very much for finding the time. The PowerPoint's already up on the screen, so let's just go, Peter. If you'd like to introduce the PowerPoint, that'll be fine. Thanks, Peter.
Thanks. My phone went at that point. Thank you very much, Phil. It's been exactly 10 years. I'll have to take my phone off the hook. Oh, it's been exactly 10 years since I last gave a Fabian Society talk,
Really?
October 2012. So I've just used the same PowerPoint outline and then changed the words a bit. Just to remind everybody that the architect of KiwiSaver was Michael Cullen. And in many ways, he was a true Fabian in politics. He was a social democrat who worked in politics. The book's well worth a look. It's a very good history of a time in New Zealand politics, including the fifth Labour government. So what I'll do is first of all give you a little bit of background about KiwiSaver and then get into the main chunk of my presentation. So just give you a little bit of information about KiwiSaver itself. I'm not in the scheme myself, so I just had to look it up. Established in 2007. It's coordinated by the IRD, which makes a huge difference because they can link people up to their tax code. And it's an opt-off system, which means that unless you consciously get out, you're in it. And that has meant that it's called auto-enrolment, and that's meant that its uptake has been at times 55, 60, 70%, and it's non-compulsory, which is pretty remarkable. Employees select their payment level, starting at 3%. Employers required to contribute at least 3%. There are about 3 million people enrolled. That's almost equivalent to the entire workforce, but only 2 million are actually contributing. So that means that probably 2/3 of people who are on the books are not actually contributing. So that's, that's a little weakness, but nevertheless, it's a good thing. Around 10% of people are in default schemes, which means that they actually haven't made a conscious choice, so that the government puts them into a scheme. Everybody else somehow or other makes a decision as to which fund they go into. There's $90 billion under management. That's huge. The New Zealand GDP is 360. That's a quarter of our entire GDP. But one surprising thing I discovered is there's $1 billion in subsidy each year, which is pretty remarkable. The average fees that people pay are about probably about 1%. I've got figures there, which I'm not exactly sure about. So just to say that the default thing I'm going to come back to later on, it's been used by the government to try to force fees down because you can then tender for the default providers, and that helps bring the fees down. The subsidy is really something I didn't realize, but that's been the way in which Michael and others have tried to encourage people to come into the scheme and stay in the scheme. And the fee levels will come back later on. They sound low, but 1% does not translate only to 1% off to your balances. It can translate into 20% off. So I'm going to have to cut this off. So I'll give you a couple of background things. So the reason I got to making this presentation was the Herald had this front page story about the government quietly introducing 100 billion tax on KiwiSaver. Boy, would that get you upset. If you were the ordinary Joe in the street, you'd think, God, this damn government has introduced 100 billion tax on KiwiSaver. What essentially was happening was that they were introducing GST applies on other pension funds, but not on KiwiSaver. And so that if you put things out to 2070, you do get to 100 billion, but that's on a total of over 2,000 billion, which is 5%, which is still substantial, but obviously the headline gets people's attention, and it got 300 comments. So that was a strong front page article, and that got me annoyed, frankly. So that was 30th of August. And then 10th of September, I managed to persuade the economics editor to allow me to get back to point out, and it's got a headline which exactly suits me, which is a GST Ferrari highlights how much fees can dent your balances. Because if a GST can do that, just think about the fees you're paying, a compound interest over 50 years, what a difference that will make. So so my comment was firstly, obviously tax is a difficult area. Secondly, there's a strong industry out there. I remember when I'm having to sorry, I've got somebody trying to get you on the phone the whole time. I pointed out that actually that when I first came across, when Michael first introduced KiwiSaver, I remember thinking, God, look at all these people who are so much in support of it. It was the industry. And the third thing is that what we learn is that a small additional cost in the early years of your retirement portfolio can result in a big impact on your balances. So that's really what the theme of this article was, and that's what I've developed in the presentation today. I got 8 comments, and it was only online. It was not on paper, so I could only go so far with the Herald. So just to give you another background thing, investment strategies. One investment strategy is the active one, which is the one we traditionally think of. We think of smart people in stockbrokers' offices, picking stocks and shares and beating the market and charging you accordingly. But in recent years, what's emerged is a thing called passive investment, which means you mirror the market, smart shares, which is run by the New Zealand Stock Exchange, and low fees. And that's revolutionized things because people can get the same results as the active one, but better because the fees are low and actually they get better returns. So that just provides you a background of how I got to this point, why I produced this presentation. It's taken me some years, I have to tell you, to sort of get up to date in this area because it's not straightforward by any means. So this sort of came together, it gelled with that article in the paper, and I sort of brought together some material which I'm going to present to you today. Okay, so the outline is, what I'm going to say is, why is KiwiSaver important? Well, we think it's a social policy, it's retirement, but actually it's economic as well, because New Zealand had a savings deficit, and this is one of the things that's helped rectify that. Secondly, the Australian experience. There's no way I could have got an understanding of this if I hadn't had the Australian experience to draw on, including this outfit called the Grattan Institute, who have again felt, just like we do here, that their super system is inefficient, uncompetitive, the fees are too high, and needs reform. And their system's been going 20 years longer than ours, 10 or 20 years longer. So there are similar issues. It's not peculiar to New Zealand. It's just that the system is not self-reforming, and you need an outside body like a government to step in. Thirdly, the New Zealand setting. I'll tell you what goes on in New Zealand. The Financial Markets Authority oversees KiwiSaver. And then I'll suggest ways in which we might move ahead. And then we have conclusion and questions towards the end. So why is KiwiSaver important? So obviously retirement provision, but also economic considerations. And even with both National Super and KiwiSaver, our retirement provision is in the bottom half of the OECD. I think National Super is great in all sorts of ways. Everybody's covered. But actually, when you compare us with other countries in the OECD who've got other pillars which they support to help people in retirement, which might be privately, a bit like KiwiSaver, you realize that we actually have some way to go if we look at other countries like us in the OECD, other welfare states, etc. Anyway, it's a signal achievement that Michael Cullen, otherwise National Super would just be going, we wouldn't be doing anything. He brought in KiwiSaver to add, not supplant, National Super, and it's going to make a big difference. So that's a big plus. Economic considerations. Firstly, savings. We've had a low savings rate. The way people save was to buy houses and sell them to each other. And we've been very reliant on overseas funds for investment. KiwiSaver has brought in $90 billion worth of potential for investment. If you add to that the super fund, 60 billion. Now the super fund would be 90 billion if the Nats hadn't stopped contributing to it. And ACC has a portfolio of 40 billion in order to pre-fund what it does. That's why I'm in favor of ACC type systems, because they're pre-funded and they provide investment potential in New Zealand, so we don't have to rely on overseas. So if you take the super fund and KiwiSaver, the super fund as it could have been, 90 billion each, that's 180 billion. So Michael Cullen, in the period of 20 years, produced investment opportunities equivalent to half our entire GDP. That is quite amazing. And that's an economic contribution. It's also a social contribution, but it's also an economic one. So we need to take that into account. Secondly, we've had a chronic balance of payments deficit, which we don't notice. These things you don't win and lose elections on your balance of payments. You win them on whether you're tough on crime or something like that. So we've relied on overseas people to buy assets off us and lend us money in order to make up a balance of payments, which is not due to poor physical exports, but due to the invisibles, which is services and things like that. So these funds make a difference because they're investing all over the world, which means that they're bringing in returns from all over the world, because New Zealand is a tiny portion of the world. So most of their investments are outside, and that's bringing in returns to New Zealand. So that's another way. And the third way, the third economic consideration is microeconomic reform. Basically, the KiwiSaver market lacks price competition. It's got plenty of competition, lots of providers, but they're not competing on price. And it's a bit like the supermarkets, except that it doesn't hit home in the same way. Supermarkets hits home because it's food and people can compare. KiwiSaver, they don't fully understand, but actually it's a similar thing that people don't have a unit price. They're not able to really compare like with like. They have to do a lot of hard work in order to do that. So these are, alongside retirement provision, are these questions of economic things. And that's why this is something that we should take account of as part of economic policy as well as social policy. Okay, the Australian experience. So that provides you with some, background to why KiwiSaver is important, what it looks like, how I got involved. Now, what parallels can we draw on? And so what I've relied on quite a bit, and I'll show you a whole lot of slides from this outfit called the Grattan Institute. They've been going since 2008, 38 million endowment, and they, like me, in fact, I've drawn on their work, have said the system that Hawke and Keating set up, which was very far-sighted, compulsory superannuation, doesn't come out of taxes. It comes out of people, their employers paying 9% plus. It's huge. But it's very inefficient and people are not getting good value for money. And that's after 20 years. 30 years. After 15 years, I think we can come to the same conclusion that our system is inefficient, not to the same scale. It doesn't have rorts in it, not many, and it's not providing good value for money. So, but I would never have come to this conclusion if I hadn't had the Grattan Institute. So what I'm going to show you is a series of slides from one of their reports from a few years ago on the need for reform to the Australian super system. and they all apply to us. So the reason I'm showing them to you is you don't find this in New Zealand. I've had to go elsewhere. There's no way you can find independent, objective information in New Zealand unless you look very hard for it. The newspapers are full of advertorial and people pushing the KiwiSaver thing, and everyone thinks that's great, but actually you're not getting the full story. And I'm not being a conspiracy theorist or anything. I mean, I came into this just thinking, well, I'm not in KiwiSaver. What does it look like, kind of thing, and drawing on the Australian experience. Okay, so what they found firstly is that Australian fees and Australian expenses along the side of here you can see the percentage of funds under management. So in the OECD, there's 0.4%. In Australia, all Australian fees, if you all add them up, it's well over to 1.2. It's 3 times the size. So Australians are paying 3 times as much expenses as they could if you were to compare it like with OECD. Well, we don't get that kind of comparison on a daily basis in New Zealand. Neither do you get them in Australia. This happens to come out of a report from a think tank using OECD data. What they then also show, which is really very striking, is that fees have absorbed 25% of the returns between 2004 and 2013 of Australian superannuation. You compare that to term deposits, obviously that's low. If you went to the stocks and shares, that would be high but risky. So super is in the middle. It should be there, about 4% return, but a good chunk of that goes in fees. People think, oh, I've got a 1% fee. That does not translate into 1% reduction in your balance. In this case, it translates into 25%. So over a number of years. So this is the kind of, let's say, dirty secret that's not well known and that people don't fully appreciate, and only the Financial Markets Authority is doing its darndest to try to make it clearer to people what they're getting into and trying to get the industry to respond accordingly. So impact of fees on final balances. So in this one, what we show here is we've got the fees along the bottom, 0.5, 1.5, 2.0. That's the annual fee. In New Zealand, it's about 1.0. Here's the impact on the final balances. If you pay 2%, as is the case in some New Zealand funds like Fisher funds, you lose a third of your final balances. That's just on 2%. If you have 1%, which is the New Zealand one, you lose 20%. Now, that's not saying that you can pay no fees. That's not, if you pay no fees, you get nothing. So it's what it's saying is what's the correct balance, and that people naturally think, I'm paying 1% a year. That means it's coming off the final balance at 1%, but actually over a period of 30, 40 years, which is a normal superannuation thing, it can translate into 20%, 25%. And this is all using standard OECD models for trying to work out on certain assumptions about the growth of the economy, the growth of people's wages, et cetera, over 40 years of a lifetime of contributions, how it works out for different levels of fees. And that's our annual level. So we're paying, people are paying about 20%, losing about 20% of their final balances, which obviously, which you could argue is more than it should be. High fees generate lower returns. So here we've got the level of returns overall is about 3.5 to 3%. Here we have the people with low fees under 50, the bottom 50%. And here are the people paying higher fees. And you can see that even though the overall returns are about the same, because the fee levels are so much higher, you're getting lower returns overall. So it is a big issue about you need to have a serious conversation or have serious comparative information that informs you about whether the fees you're paying, what impact that's having on your final balances and whether they're value for money. And this is the Australian experience with the bottom 50% here, where the fees are sort of, about 1%. And then once the fees get larger, the returns remain the same, but the balance gets reduced because the fees are so high. Fees reduce returns. Here's another one. I won't go any further on this, but here's a average compared with the market. Are you better than the market? And people with low fees, that's 1% and below, usually get better than the market, the average for the industry. But once you get above that, you lose. So I don't want to overdo it, but the truth is you just have to look at the fees. I didn't realize this when I got into this business. I hadn't fully appreciated, and I think most people don't, because they just think they're in the hands of experts. They're only paying 1%. What the hell? And they want it done and dusted, and then they get on with their lives. And then in 30, 40 years' time, they'll have a nice pension. And you do put your trust in these people. So what they also find is that tenders can reduce fees. That's a way in which this government has reduced fees. They've opened up the default sector to tenders, and that's forced the fees down in a very small way, actually. And in Australia, up till now, we've had non-fee selection, which means defaults were selected only, not selected on whether they had low fees. But now the government is requiring fees, the level of fees, to be one of the criteria by which they select the default providers. That is, providers for people who don't select a company. So that's one way in which you can get, government can help fees to bring down, is to actually tender, provide more information, tender. There's various ways in which governments can try to bring the fees down to a reasonable level. Okay, the New Zealand setting, the Financial Markets Authority. What they're working under regulations that were set up, I assume, back in the time of Michael Cullen, where the obligation not to charge an unreasonable fee is an ongoing obligation. That is an obligation, apparently, but how do you identify what is a reasonable fee? And how do you then enforce it? So fees must not be unreasonable. There it is in black and white. The manager of the scheme, the supervisor, the administrator, investment manager, the guy who takes the commission, who sends you off to the bank, to the Kiwi front, they should be under an obligation. But how do you identify a reasonable fee? I mean, I just think this is magical thinking, and it was the only way. I use the word, I probably shouldn't use it, but they're doing their best to work within it. They're trying to encourage the industry to be more reasonable, but the truth is they have very few levers. They can fine them, but we've had 15 years and I haven't come across any company being fined for unreasonable fees. So it is something which they're struggling with. I started this thinking the FMA was not doing a good job. It was too close to the industry. But actually, now I realize that actually it's damn hard. And if the industry can get the government to do a U-turn on GST on fees within 24 hours, just think of the power they have if they wanted to get tough with the FMA. They could do all sorts of media tricks if they really were serious about it. And that's my reading of they have to tread quite carefully. And I'll give you a few more examples of how regulators in this country are tiptoeing around. Whether it's supermarkets, electricity, telcos, they need a bit of political support if they're going to do the things that actually help consumers. Okay, let's look at a few slides that I've put together on the New Zealand setting. Just to say that this week, Fisher's Funds, which is one of in my view, the worst example of the KiwiSaver, they're thoroughly private, and I've got no problem with them being that. They advertise, they charge fees of 2%. But in the 12 months to date, it earned 199 million in fees, despite only having operating expenses of 56 million. And from that, it paid a dividend to shareholders. So you can imagine if the FMA goes along to a fund manager and says, by the way, you should reduce your fees. He says, well, hang on, mate. I've got shareholders and I've got commercial people above me. These are all banks, by the way. The 9 of the top 10 providers are bank KiwiSaver. So they'd say, hang on, mate. we've got to make $1 out of this. Don't be silly. I mean, FMA, you know, what are you talking about? This is a commercial operation. So we've got to be aware that there is another pressure point going there, that these outfits are commercial outfits, and I've got no problem with that. It's just that I think that they sort of overplayed their hand. Okay, so this is a review of fees done by this outfit here since 2009, and you can see that they were up well over 1, and they have declined. So that's a good news story. Fees have declined from the late 2000s to the early 2020s. They've declined by about 50%. They've been maybe 1.5 down to about 1 on average. So something's going on there, whatever it is. So that's a good news story. So it's not as if reduction in fees is impossible. But then the FMA asked the same outfit to do a comparison of the UK and New Zealand. And they found that actually the UK system is based on ours. It's a copy. Their fees are less than half the fees that our people are charging. And that study was carried out either last year or the year before. So this is a system that's based on auto-enrolment, and the fees that are being levied on British equivalent to KiwiSavers are half what's being required from KiwiSavers here. So there is an issue. Even though the fees have reduced, there is an issue. The KiwiSaver, the FMA have tried to provide guidance. The FMA has an ongoing focus on where their KiwiSaver schemes provide good value for money. I think that's a good phrase. We're looking for value for money. We're not looking for cheap and dirty. We're looking for value for money. What they find is where you've got big companies, that's not typically, they should have economies of scale, that's not being shared. This is the FMA, it's not me. This is the FMA. This is last year or the year before. There is no systematic relationship between fees charged and returns received. Just think about that. You could be charged high fees and you get the same returns as somebody who's being charged low fees. This is the FMA. No systematic relationship. There is no systematic relationship between fees charged and degree of active management. In other words, if you'd expect that somebody charge you high fees would be actively managing in order to beat the market, even though there's no such thing. But here's the FMA. They said there's no, people get paid high fees when in fact the guys are running just index funds, which don't require much management at all. So you can understand the FMA has got, frankly, very, reading between the lines, impatient with the industry. It's waited a long time and it's still not getting anywhere. And active funds typically do not perform their market index after fees. So in other words, they're meant to have a market benchmark and they're not outperforming them as they should. So that's a KiwiSaver a couple of years ago. In the last year, they did a thing called value for money. This is very encouraging because I think that's the right terminology. We're not looking for cheap and dirty. We're looking for value for money so that people put their money in. They know they're getting a good return given all the other understandings about how the industry operates and comparing it with good comparisons that are fair. So the results of the pilot were published. What they found is that there were good managers, but the truth was the fees were such that you couldn't tell who the good managers were and the poor managers. That the fees sort of eradicated that. Fund managers are not using an appropriate market index. In other words, the fund managers were selecting benchmarks that suited them, that gave them a good story. I don't know why they're allowed to do this. So, you know, you could go to a KiwiSaver and they say, look, compare us with our benchmark. We're doing fine. But they could have selected a benchmark based on a more conservative approach while they were doing a slightly more growth-oriented one. And so they'd look good. Managers commonly pay commission to third parties. You're not meant, so in other words, they're paying other people to send savers to these. So they're actually buying KiwiSavers. They're not actually, what should be happening is KiwiSaver should be going to an independent advisor who says, now look here is the market. Here are all the different people that you could go to. These are the ones that, in my view, if we look at all of the data, the criteria, these are the ones that really perform best. No, they're getting paid a commission. And if a third party is being paid a commission, why would they go anywhere else? So, and the FMA, I'm not sure if it's the next one or it's this one. If you read this report, it's quite amusing. You can tell they use the phrase, this is nonsense. Actually, in this report, they're actually getting impatient with the industry. The industry is saying, for example, there's no market failure. Essentially, there is a market failure here because we're not getting competition, getting more efficient and more effective companies. That is not happening. That is a market failure. So we're not getting that. And yet they argued that they did not have to have benchmark comparisons that were telling. And the person, their report, they write, this is nonsense. This is FMA. So the FMA have got to the point, just reading between the lines, where I'm not sure they know what else to do. They've tried everything reasonable, and the industry is not responding. So one area where the FMA has had help from the government and the government has operated is in default memberships. So 5 providers were removed from the default list. That is, from people who don't choose a provider, because they were not providing good enough service. I mean, that's what should be happening. And they brought in 4 remaining ones and 2 new providers. So this is frankly what should be happening, but this only happens with default members, and they only account for 10% of the enrollment. So there you have, that's the 5 departing providers, that sum is 2.5 billion. So that's a lot of money, and that has been converted to the 4 remaining providers, 2 new providers. That's what should be happening, and it can only happen in the default market. You look at the number of members, they've got 250,000 members, 236,000. So that's a lot of people out of 3 million, you know, it's only 10% out of 2.5 million. And they've been switched. So they've gone to the 4 remaining providers and 2 new providers. That's what should be happening. But it can only happen in this area where the government has the legitimacy and can enforce a sort of a shift. And this has just happened under this government in the last year. So going back to the magical thinking, an unfair thing, it's not a reflection on the FMA, it's a reflection on the impossible tasks they have. And in doing this, I just give you a few other examples of other regulators who've got a tough job. Okay, here's the first thing. The Commerce Commission has recommended a series of tweaks to the supermarket sector, but stopped short of some of the tough measures it contemplated. That was the case in March this year. The government realized that this was not good enough, and it did not obviously go the full way of breaking them up or anything like that, but it did a whole lot of other things like breaking the legal obstacles and, apart from anything else, requiring unit pricing. Imagine it, what a revolution. So people could compare. So you could just see that even here, where there's a duopoly, and it's clear that the Commerce Commission found that this outfit was making, making undue profits, that was a lever, but actually it needed the government to assist it to do that. The electricity market isn't perfect. This is October the 12th, but few markets are. This related to the fact that it does look as though the existing retailers, generators, the big 4, are frankly, with TY Point, the government didn't want TY Point to continue, but they went and made a deal with TY Point, which we were all subsidizing. And they were perfectly happy for this. And also, they're not stumping up with new generator capacity. They're quite happy to have the thing the way it is. So we will need international newcomers to come into the market, and we'll need to deal with the legal obstacles that these guys are putting up. For example, they're putting caveats on areas where you could put wind farms, saying that they're going to develop them, but never doing so. Wow, what a clever thing to do. And finally, telcos. Commerce Commission has asked telcos to make 4 changes. Now, that's a heck of a lot easier to do because the changes they're making, everyone can see. The person with the mobile phone. And this is the problem we've got with KiwiSaver. It's not nearly as evident as in telcos or the supermarket. It's much more like the electricity market, where it looks a bit distant. People don't really know what's going on. They just know they've got power on. They're happy enough. Similarly with the KiwiSaver, they're just happy it's going, and they're going the way it is. So that's a New Zealand issue, is how do we get our regulators, market regulators, to ensure that the markets are functioning justly, but also efficiently, and providing outcomes that are good for the country overall. In other words, decent food at cheap rates, electricity at a decent rate. For example, one of the generators was spilling water when there was too much water, because that would have brought the prices down, because there'd been a lot of water in the hydroelectric lakes that would have brought the prices down. And that was identified, and they were not sanctioned. So you know, there is an issue there. And that market's been going for a good 20, 30 years. And then the telcos, which is another market, since telecom. And that's only, again, like KiwiSaver, because it was the government of Helen and Michael Cullen that broke the telecom monopoly and had then to produce it subject to Commerce Commission. Okay, the way ahead. Well, okay, so I'll go through each of these. Firstly, I think there should be an inquiry, either by the Commerce Commission or the Productivity Commission. Possibly the Commerce Commission might have a little bit more spine than it has had in some other respects, if it's got a government supporting it. I mean, you could understand if you can get a headline like that in the Herald, that can make the government turn and drop what was a perfectly reasonable budgetary initiative. Because I don't have KiwiSaver, but I pay 15% on my fees. But people in KiwiSaver don't. So there's an anomaly there, which hasn't been eradicated. So, so an inquiry by somebody after 15 years, I think is perfectly reasonable. Here's another idea. This is off the top of my head. I think they should set a specific pension target. I mean, what Michael was up to was just getting this off the ground, getting KiwiSaver off the ground. And it was world leading. It was auto-enrolment, and other countries. We're held up with the OECD as a country that has really pushed the boundaries. So I'm not, again, I think the KiwiSaver thing's up in principle a great thing. But I think I'm going to suggest we could have a specific pension target, which is where you go, particularly for low-income people, because low-income people are the ones I think been screwed by the system. The well-off people, they can afford it. They can actually read the literature, and they've got more time on their hands. They've got more income literacy, et cetera, et cetera. We need to protect the people for whom the super is really not going to be enough when they won't have their houses. So we need another layer on top of the super, which actually the KiwiSaver will provide. That's my idea. We need to focus on empowering the lower fee providers. Perhaps we should bring in the super fund as a provider. They have had returns of 10% for 20 years each year, and their fee charge is 0.3%, which is what Simplicity charges in KiwiSaver, and that's probably as low as you go, which is what I get charged for my non-KiwiSaver low fees, no frills guy in Whakatane. That's as low as you can go. If you go any lower than that, you'd have questions about it. The next bullet point, we need to constantly show people how their account is doing and facilitate switching for better value. And we need to use tendering and subsidy to do the job. The government's got $1 billion. It should use it better. So I'm going to show you a couple of slides. Here's the Australian, 2018. Superannuation, assessing efficiency and competitiveness. That's what we're on about. We're not about bleeding heart little liberals, although we are that. I mean, that's why Michael set it up in one respect, but we're also on about, hang on, people are being ripped off. This thing is not efficient and it's not competitive, although it looks like it. There's lots of providers, but actually there are far too many. If it was truly competitive, I don't know how a lot of those providers could survive, and they're surviving because the margins are so good. So that's my interpretation. Setting a savings target. If you look at us in relation to the OECD replacement income replacement rate for people on retirement using average earnings of 70% of average earnings. It's not of all earnings, just average earnings. And there's the OECD. New Zealand is 40%. So national super at present, which is in many respects a good system, is providing only 40% of net replacement rate if you relate that to average earnings. And now with people not having their own homes, etc., that it strikes me that in a way you could say for low-income people, a KiwiSaver system properly managed to keep the fees low and have the subsidies properly targeted would actually assist in doing it. That's just my off the top of the head thing that I developed as I went into this more depth. Establishing an informative benchmark. This is the New Zealand Super Fund. They use a passive fund as a benchmark in order to show whether they're doing better. And so you can see here, here's the passive fund, 0. And here are what they add going back to 2012 each quarterly. And sometimes they get lower. So that demonstrates to everybody what active management makes a difference over and above just using a benchmark that just mirrors the market, which is what you could do otherwise and do perfectly well doing that. So what you really need is what I call an informative benchmark, not one that just suits you, which is what a lot of the companies are using, one that gives you information as to how well your company's doing. The FMA has got a good thing here called KiwiSaver Tracker. I only discovered it by accident. And what they do is they look at, here's the beginnings, alphabetically ordered, and they look at people of 5-year average return. So the average return here is about 6 to 7%. And then they look at what impact fees have made. So for example, here, all the fees are taking about 18, 19% off, which is what happens if you're paying about 1% in fees. And here's the other lot. Here are some 22, 23%. There's even one here was a third. So there is a tracker present that is, I don't know how many people use it, but you could actually work out whether the company you're going for, the saver, actually how they're going for the impact of fees on your returns. My final slide here before I conclude is market segmentation. It's quite interesting. This is that company again. The company says, this company, this company, I looked at their report. The trouble is these companies are all beholden to the industry. So this company obviously gets a lot of their business from the industry. And they say, look, it's very competitive. Look at the number of companies. And there are probably, I think there are 200 and plus KiwiSaver providers. And they say that means it's competitive, but actually, if you look at the fees, it's not competitive. So here they show the top ones, and you can see they're all 1.5 to 2%. And you look at the bottom quotes, bottom of the market, and they're all under 0.5%. Whether they're all good or not, I wouldn't know. But Simplicity, BNZ is obviously a bank. Westbank is a bank. Simplicity is one that I know about. So in my view, there's a market segmentation here, and what the government should concentrate on is the lower end and make sure that that becomes the norm. And if wealthy people and better off people want to go to here, fair enough. In my view, what FMA should be concentrating on is this end of the market, informing those people up this end for sure, but concentrating on making sure that these ones are bona fide, are good, and are providing good services. Okay, conclusion. So the KiwiSaver is a great policy innovation. I think it shows you so much about Michael Cullen and his breadth of vision. You've got the super fund, working for families. I know some people don't agree, but actually these are all, in my view, put New Zealand back in the mainstream of welfare states after the madness of the 1990s. Both social and economic objectives, that's the key thing. There's a social one, which is retirement, but the economic ones as well. They've got to be competitive. They've got to be efficient. They provide us with investment funds. They might invest in KiwiRail, or they might invest in housing, affordable housing, which the ACC is coming up to put a whole lot of money into some affordable housing because it sees it as a return. However, it is now apparent it's not delivering value for money, particularly for lower SES. This is after 15 years, so you could say it's bedded in, and this is a reasonable time. There's lack of price competition, as evidenced by the UK data, which shows that they have half the rate, and the impact of tendering, which reduced fees by only 11%, I have to say, but it reduced them. And my conclusion is the government can use the 1 billion it spends and the competitive tendering it conducts much more digitally and concentrate more on Pacific's pension target. For example, it could tell people in the information you get, if you continue with this provider at this level of fees till the end of retirement, this is what your retirement income will look like in relation to what we're trying to achieve, which is a supplement to national super. And this is what it would look like. Once you've achieved it, maybe you can sit back and think, I've done my job. I don't know. That's just my suggestion. Make it more concrete. At present, it's not very concrete for people. Just looks like an investment thing. Anyway, the primary thing is, frankly, we need an inquiry and we need people to look at it closely. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Peter. Would you like to just diminish the slide now so we can have the full screen? Can you do that?
Yeah.
That's it. That's it. And we're open for questions. And Len Cook, you've got your hand up already. Go, Len. Nice to see you there, Len.
Unmute yourself, Len.
Not usually a problem I have. Peter, can I say, I think you've described a lot, but you're really trying to shift the deck chairs on the Titanic. That the fundamental issues with KiwiSaver are that it does nothing to change working life inequities in retirement. So I don't see it as a welfare state scheme at all. I think that it doesn't provide a pension at the other end, nor does the Australian. It really is a simple saving scheme. There are other options government could have adopted, inflation-adjusted bonds, for example. We could have, the way we manage New Zealand Super, which is an extraordinary scheme. When you look at the Australians, with their scheme, because of its scale, it has come at the cost of the alternative complementary state benefit being means tested, and therefore massively different from New Zealand Super. I just don't understand why the state should be involved in something which simply generally looks after the savings of people who are generally more affluent and does virtually nothing for the savings of people who have very little income. You know, there's a lot of other ways we could do that rather than create this mechanism. So just to be slightly contrary.
Yeah. So the truth is we've got a system. And I've emphasized that we should be concentrating on lower income people. I completely agree with you. What do I wonder? Why would I worry about Fisher funds? If they're charging 2% and high income people are using it, let them do so. What I'm worried about is the lower income people. How can we ensure? And we could do all sorts of things. When they fall out of work, we could maintain their contributions. When women are not in work, and are maybe doing more childcare, domestic funding, we could ensure that their contributions help. So there are a number of ways. I mean, the truth is, Len, the last time Labor tried this was the New Zealand Superannuation Free scheme in 1975. We also did a wholesale restructure of the health service, and both were resoundingly rejected by the population. So what we're doing now, as I see it, early childhood education, that's full of private providers. Primary care, it's full of private providers. KiwiSaver, it's full of private providers. So I just think we've moved from the state being a major provider in its own right, unless it's required to do so, like in education, and becoming a regulator to get the best social outcomes for what otherwise can be unhelpful market dynamics. And I quite agree with you on that.
I just wish our regulators could do their job.
I totally agree. That's why I've itemized them all. They've all failed. And it's if you look at the Commerce Commission, originally they weren't even allowed to pick up topics. Topics had to be brought to their, so they've been constrained from the start. They had to pick up topics that were brought to their attention. Also, the definition of competition was not outcomes. Now it's outcomes, so that you can actually have you can actually say that the KiwiSaver looks competitive superficially, but actually it requires it is not, if it's not competitive, because the returns are so low. Okay, thanks.
Further questions from the floor? I can't believe it. Peter, I've got a question. We've had a couple of speakers before on the FMA, particularly worried about the fact that they don't pursue the ethical domain of where the money is invested in KiwiSavers and other things. They're still continuing to invest their money in fossil fuels, for example.
Do you mean FMA or super fund?
No, the FMA.
Well,
whether or not they would act as a police force on the ethical investment.
Yeah. Well, it's a bit like Len's point. In a way, we're dealing with private providers, and as long as you ensure that there are providers who say that they are ethical and sustainable, ESG and good governance or something like that. So there are providers who put their mark out there, and then the role of the FMA is to make sure that they are kosher, that they actually do invest in ethical. I don't think the FMA can go out there and tell everybody KiwiSaver you're not allowed to invest in non-ethical things. They can say, here are the guidelines. You can let the KiwiSaver realize this, and if that upsets them, then they should not be investing in them. The super fund, I think, has moved comprehensively towards not investing in fossil fuel and other things because they're a government agency, and there's plenty of other options available. So it's a bit harder with KiwiSaver. As I say, I think FMA have got enough on their plate. I started off thinking FMA was hopeless, a bit like Len was saying. They're just not doing their job, and I think they're huffing and puffing, frankly, and they're not doing anything. And then when I look closely, I could see that if the industry can get the government to U-turn in 24 hours because of a front page Herald headline, just imagine what they could do if they didn't like what the FMA was doing. So, you know, I'm not providing any excuses. I just think somehow or other we've got to sort of stiffen their spine and somehow make it easier for the market to work. I don't think the FMA should be going in there and telling people to do this and the other. What they should really be doing is making sure that competitive pressures, with users realizing that they're actually not getting good value for money, then migrating to companies where they are getting good value for money. Yeah. That's what talks.
Yeah. People, if you want to ask a question, of course, just use the yellow hand at the bottom of the screen.
There's Paul Tudor up there.
Yeah, Paul, I spotted you. Take your mute off and let's have your question.
Well, I'm not sure that you can answer this one, but I had heard that the number of withdrawals from the last 2 years, year and a half, on the grounds of hardship have been higher than the previous couple of years. So obviously we're going through a pretty tough time, or have been. Do we need to somehow skew the field for lower income people to participate in KiwiSaver? Because at the moment, as Len says quite rightly, it is generally the more well-to-do people who are participating. Yeah, this COVID time has obviously raised that.
Yeah, well, there's two things there. Firstly, I think Michael just wants to get this thing, I can't read his mind, to get this thing up and running. And so the subsidies, you're talking about $1 billion every year from the government. In my view, those subsidies could be used much more judiciously to help those people. Secondly, people withdrawals, the OECD, or was it the IMF, felt that the KiwiSaver should not be used to help people invest in housing, because they argued that without an increase in supply, all that was doing was pushing up the prices. And I think that was true, but that's a hard thing to get across. But I totally agree with you. I think we've got to the point where what Michael was doing was trying to get something established. What we now have a government, I mean, which may or may not be in power much longer, but it has the right ethos. It should be looking at this not just as a generic private driven KiwiSaver, as Len was saying, but should look at it should also look at the potential social benefits it could accrue for people who, when they get to retirement, will just have national super, but actually they will actually quite possibly be more hard up, and they will need that extra layer, which could well be assisted in some way by the state. So yeah, I think that could be part of the terms of a commission of inquiry, either by the Commerce Commission or the Productivity Commission, or a one-off like a Royal Commission.
It could also be a people's inquiry, Peter.
Sorry?
We could also have a people's inquiry about.
Yeah, but I know, Phil, it sounds sort of radical and all the rest of it, but the truth is, now and then you need, like, I know you may not agree with me, but the reason we have a single city, and I think it's a good thing, is because we had a Royal Commission. There's no way that when I first arrived in Auckland, there were 30 boroughs. And there's no way that the politicians could have achieved that, because you'd get all sorts of parochial interests. It required a Royal Commission. So in a way, sometimes you need these kind of independent inquiries, as long as they've got the right terms of reference. And of course, its recommendations were accepted by the incoming national government. Whether that would happen on KiwiSaver is another question.
Maybe Len Cook's looking for a new job. Sorry, Len. Anybody else out there with a question? I'm looking forward to another question. I can't believe that it's...
I'm afraid it's a bit technical at times, but...
Peter, I'd like to thank you for what you've done tonight. It's covered a lot of territory, and it certainly opened up a lot of thoughts. And you're not reluctant to say what's on your mind as a way of trying to push us into thinking what we should have in our own heads about this material. And I want to thank you for the work you put in. That was quite a long and comprehensive PowerPoint and a very useful address. So thank you very much, Peter.
Yeah, and my thanks to you for making the Fabian Society what it is, and also to Michael Cullen. I mean, this is a tribute. The fact that we're still talking about what he did, along with the Super Fund, look around you if you want to see the achievements. Something like Michael Cullen, look around you at the institutional framework and what he achieved. He and Helen did a whole lot of things to move New Zealand back into that mainstream, and this is one of them.
Yes, and thank you for the hands. I just see giving a bit of an affy to that point.